I think it's very important, and it was also part of the original concept of SMART. At the end of the day, Australia's a country of 22 million people, so there's a practical limitation on the size and nature of what happens in Australia on anything, including infrastructure. So when in Gerard Sutton's time we applied for the Commonwealth grant, the idea was to create not only an Australian centre of excellence, but to actually become a global centre of excellence. And I think this symposium is reasonable evidence that SMART is at least on the way to being successful, partly because it has involved very many of the Australian universities and researchers, and also because there's a significant overseas presence, and because there's a bit of a timetable and a pathway for the next few years around the world. So yeah, the infrastructure is a global issue. Many of the issues are identical. Some of them are not. Some of them are local and political. But I think it's well down the way to becoming a genuine global player, which is the idea. Oh, look, I think they're all the subjects, dare I say it, of the symposium. Clearly, prioritisation, working out what ought to happen, making sure we've got the right processes to assess what is really worth doing, because there's never going to be enough money for everything. I think getting the right governance, I think getting the right interaction between levels of government so that you do get a genuine public interest approach. I think there's some of the key things, and I think regulation. Politicians run 100 miles from regulation, especially when it involves pricing, but the truth is we've got to get past the notion that infrastructure is just concrete and steel. Sure, a bit of it is, quite a bit, but it is also about using the existing assets. It's about pricing the peak so that the demand varies and you don't have to spend as much money for very little benefit. So look, there's a wide range of things, but they're pretty much the subject matter of the week's symposium. So I think one of the problems is that the real difficulty in infrastructure is political will, and politicians by their nature tend not to attend symposiums. They tend to come and speak and go away. I think we need to understand that the infrastructure community, which is broadly represented here this week, actually needs to work out how to help the politicians, because there's no point talking to ourselves and reaching pretty furious agreement, which I think on most issues one can do in infrastructure. One really needs to work out how one facilitates or enables governments to come to some of the conclusions that the experts have come to, because that's where the real gap is not between the policymakers and the bureaucracy and the academics and the researchers, or indeed the private sector companies that are in the field. I think all of them are broadly in agreement. If there's a gap, and there is, and it is around the world, not just in Australia, it's between politicians' assessments of what is politically doable and the infrastructure community's view of what's desirable, and that's quite an important gap. Yeah, well, I mean, that's what's being tried with Infrastructure Australia, Infrastructure New South Wales. It is partly about depoliticising the process, and that's clearly a desirable thing to do for the reason that your question suggests. I think you have to be realistic. I think to depoliticise infrastructure when in fact it's being paid for by the government, essentially by the taxpayers, or indeed where the government's regulating it, I don't think you can depoliticise. At the end of the day, you have to accept that even though politicians have short time frames, and we're talking about 50 and 100-year assets, we do have to make the reconciliation with governments and the body politic. It'd be nice if the experts could just do it by themselves, but that isn't, of course, the way the system works. So I think it is a good thing that policymakers are present, and there's a broad section of the infrastructure community here. Next time round, Vienna, wherever it is, it'd be nice to have a handful of people from both sides of politics in the various countries as well, because I think you at least want them to understand the logic, even though they may ultimately make decisions through a different prism sort of voter acceptability, but at least they need to understand the logic of what's being put out. We tend naturally to gravitate to projects, and as several speakers said on the first day, it really ought to be about systems, it ought to be about networks, it needs to be about the big picture. It isn't ultimately about a bridge or a tunnel or a port or whatever it might be. So I think that's undeniably right, but again I think one needs to be realistic. Things are driven, even in academia, a bit by money, and the money connects to individual projects. So whilst absolutely urban renewal, sustainability, environmental and resilience issues, a whole range of things are really very, very important. And they are about the network, the total, not about the project. I think you can just need to reconcile the two, because realistically, many players make their money, get their jollies out of project-specific things. So we do need to start with the network, we do need to start with land use planning, all of those sorts of logical things. And we just need to have a clear-cut process as to how individual projects fit into the bigger picture. I think it's made a very significant progress in a reasonably short time. It's only 2 years, I guess, old, and I think it's got the opportunity, partly because it's not self-interested, partly because it is an academic entity, but it's got wide range of support, and because it's taken an ecumenical approach to involving other universities and other researchers. I think it's got a chance of being a genuine global leader, which is what we set out to do.